And then we're going to open it up to the audience to ask questions, if you would like, before closing. All right, are you ready?
I think so.
Okay, so I want to just jump right into the film. The narrator of the film, Bobby, states the following: I was brought up to hate Germans and Germany. That was at the very beginning of the film. Some people still hold prejudices against the German people due to the atrocities of World War II. How do you think this impacts us today, and how do we move forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you know, what I can't do is speak to your experience as Jews because I'm a goy. But what I do every day for a living is try to, understand the causes, consequences, the effects of prejudice on people. And what I see in this film, and I think it's about the historical record and the way in which, what happened in Nazi Germany in the 30s that led to World War II, the final solution, that we carry with us all the time. And being the target of that type of violence and oppression is something that is passed along through our family histories. The stories continue to be told, and so there's just memory being passed on all the time. What I think about is many groups in this country that have been the target of all kinds of oppression, slavery for black people in this country, for example. Very similar sort of history that goes along with that. But for me, as a scholar who tries to understand the psychology of these issues, what I think about a lot right now is how much many of the things that led to the Holocaust seem to be coming back around politically for us right now. And so what I think we're all sort of dealing with is the concern that maybe there's a cycle to this. And when I think about how it's affecting us today, I think politically we're dealing with, and it's tough for me not to talk about politics these days with these topics, but it feels to me like we're coming back around to authoritarian types of policies, authoritarian fascist types of governments and leaders, charismatic leaders who can lead people down these kinds of paths. And the concerns that I have about the way that history feels like it's trying to repeat itself, and how important it is to really fight against that as much as we can. So that's what's on my mind these days. And when I'm teaching my classes at the university, like this semester, I teach a class on prejudice. These are the things that I'm trying to help the students today understand.
Thank you. This film is about media, and media plays a big role in the film. And I want to ask you a question about media and prejudice. How have the messages of disseminating prejudice changed over time? Specifically, maybe how have some of the forms of media, like social media, 24-hour news, worked in either dispelling or amplifying prejudice and discrimination?
Yeah, so what I think I see these days is that the messages the content of the messages hasn't actually changed. The way that the messages are disseminated most certainly has. What we know psychologically about what leads people to feel prejudice, to develop stereotypes, to act in discriminatory ways, is feeling threatened by a group that's different from them. And so the messages, if you go back and you study the messages, and Yud is a good example of this, that Goebbels developed through what we think of as their propaganda machines. It was very much centered on the threat that Jews pose to German society. Two types of threat tend to underlie these kinds of messages. There's the realistic threat, so the idea that a group is coming to either annihilate you, or a group is coming to take your resources from you. And you can hear in today's messages that we especially get again from some politicians, those kinds of threats are certainly or groups are being portrayed as being threatening to either, our existence or to resources, political resources, economic resources. The other threats that are very clear in Nazi propaganda, and again, coming back around right now, are what we call symbolic threats. So that groups are threatening to our cultural way of life. Not necessarily our existence or resources, but our values, our traditions. And so to the degree that the media can, and there's lots of this out there right now, people can use the media to portray particular groups as being a threat, realistic threat or a symbolic threat, that can then motivate people to want to annihilate the threat. And they do that through the way they vote. As one example, there are many, many examples of the ways people will try to reduce the threat. So what I think is that many of the messages and the way that you get people, to side with you against another group is you point out that they're a threat to you. So let's do something about that threat. And so the messages are very much the same. The fundamental human motives that they engage are the same. But social media has really become a major problem because of how quickly, you think about making a film like Youth Zeus and how long that took to make, right? That was the primary mode of media dissemination. Now, I can pick up my phone right now and go on Twitter if I, follow certain people and find all kinds of those kinds of messages, and they're coming out instantaneously, right? The conspiracy theories that lead to this belief about the threats, all of that. So it comes out a lot faster, but I think the messages are very much the same.
Thank you. Okay, having another question. The suffering that's created by prejudice and discrimination is difficult to quantify. And in many cases, it damages both the persecutor and the persecuted irreparably. Although it's likely that prejudice will always exist, what can we do to lessen it?
Yeah, that's a great question. We spend a lot of time in our lab working on that very question. There's a lot of interesting research that's starting to come out on the harm it causes people who are prejudiced. And we published a paper recently actually showing that there's a substantial correlation between holding prejudice towards Black or American Indian people and dying from cardiovascular disease. So prejudiced people are more likely to die of cardiovascular disease to the degree that they hold prejudice. I don't know the causal direction in that. It's a correlational finding. But it does suggest that, yeah, prejudice is harmful for your health. Being prejudiced is harmful for your health. That, in many ways does not compare to the harm that being the target of somebody's prejudice can cause, right? And there's plenty of evidence on that side as well. Some of the work that we're getting ready to do is looking at the harm that patients suffer when their doctor expresses bias towards them in a very, very subtle way. So people don't remember their meeting with their doctor because the doctor microaggressed or stereotyped them in some way. So on the what can we do, that's a big question, and there are a number of strategies that as a scientist, I'm always about, okay, what's the evidence that something works to reduce prejudice, right? There's lots of things that people think work, but they don't if you actually put them to an experimental test. But there are many things that do work really well. One of the things I think that's really, really critical is education. And, I think we're in a big fight right now in this country, certainly pretty close to home here in Arizona, over can we talk about these issues in public education? Should we be talking about these issues at a university? And many of you may know that in Florida, they passed a law that actually would prevent someone like me from teaching the classes I teach at the University of Arizona, or even doing the research I do at the University of Arizona, the anti-woke law. We came very, very close here in Arizona last year to a constitutional amendment that would have been on the ballot in November that looked very much the same way. And me and several other people in town have been writing op-eds and trying to do what we can to kind of push back against this. Fortunately, that didn't get very far in our legislature, so it didn't happen. Otherwise, we would have been in the same boat that many of my colleagues that work at the universities in Florida are in right now, where they're canceling their classes because they don't want to lose their jobs, right? So that, when I think about what that means essentially we can't, and some laws I should mention did pass here in Arizona that really prevent teachers at the K through 12 level from talking about, the Holocaust or talking about slavery and all the other forms of discrimination that occur in classrooms with kids from a very early age. So that by the time Dana and I get them at the university, they're hearing it for the first time. They're hearing it in a very honest, direct way for the first time. That'd be one thing I would certainly, wish we could do something about, to, be much more like I think they are in Germany about the Holocaust and the education that people get there from a very early age, very honest and open, conversations about it. So education is big, that's important, and we've got a big fight on our hands right now with that one. There's some other things that I know work as well, but maybe I'll let you ask another question.
Should I ask another question, or should I see if we have any questions from the audience, perhaps? It's hard for me to still see everybody, but Jennifer is rowing around with the microphone.
Yes, there are two things I'd like to bring to your attention. When I was about 25, the young man behind our house and I were friends, close friends, and his parents, they were all Czech. And both parents had been at Auschwitz and survived, and they had serial numbers tattooed on them, and they never removed them. And on one occasion, this mother, name slips my mind, but she needed to be driven to the German consulate in Los Angeles to renew the fact that she's still alive and should continue to get her reparations payments. And we were standing in line. We were not next, but there was somebody just in front of us. And the agent there working there, a young German woman, was having a conversation in German with the person ahead of us. And this woman turned to me and said, "Oh, that young woman, she speaks such beautiful German." And that was a change in my life, because the notion that she could find the sound of German to be beautiful was a complete shock to my prejudices and views and expectations. And fast forward a number of years later, I found myself living and working in Germany for 2 years. Outside of Frankfurt was the office, and I spent some months in Wiesbaden. And I found Germany to be a very different place from what I expected. And people who found out I was Jewish went out of their way to be accommodating, nice, friendly, pleasant, and supportive to me. And so for me, I still now have 2 friends who are German since that time, and that's just never going to go away.
Thank you for pointing out some of the beauty that can come out of this. And that you saw that in the film. The friendship between those 2 men was a long, strong friendship, and it was threatened by some of the things they were finding out about their families, but it eventually made them stronger as friends. Thank you. Looks like we have another question.
I could add something to that, which is one of the other, of all the research that's been done in my field of social psychology on how to reduce prejudice, one of the most powerful, reliable effects that relates very much to the stories that you're telling, and we see in the film as well, is when people have contact that's positive across group boundaries where there's conflict, when that contact leads to friendship, it transfers beyond that that immediate friendship to anyone else of that group. And so, yeah, I think what we see with them and the stories that you're telling, especially having been in Germany, being able to have that contact across groups. The problem is contact. Sometimes people come into contact and it's a negative experience, and that doesn't help, right? But when it's a positive intergroup contact experience, that does help. That does reduce prejudice. Thank you.
My question is, are human beings hardwired to be prejudiced? Because it exists all over the world. You know, African tribes are prejudiced against others. And if so, is it nature, nurture, a little bit of both? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's hardwired in the following way, that when we feel threatened, it's hard to like the people that are threatening us. That's pretty fundamental to survival. So yeah, you gave an example of tribes in Africa. Yeah, pretty much humans respond to threat in that way. Now, the nature-nurture question is interesting because I'm very much a nurture person in what I do for a living in my whole thought about human psychology, which is that most of our behavior is driven by what's going on in the immediate situation, and if you can change the way we interpret what's happening to us, you can change that response. So that's what I think a lot of the prejudice reduction strategies that I know of that are empirically verified are doing, is they're allowing us to interpret outgroup members in a different way. They're no longer a threat because we're focused on what we have in common. They're no longer a threat because I'm seeing things from their perspective and I feel empathy for them. So in other words, yeah, our default, as I like to say, is to sort of be wary of threat, right? It's kind of fundamental. But what we can do, we have these great big brains, and these great big brains can be used to reinterpret the immediate situation and what we're perceiving, and that through education and experience can happen.
I'm going to jump in with this. I'm a developmental psychologist, and so
Nature.
So yeah, we focus more on nature and inborn. But I'm not going to say that I think prejudice is inborn. But what I will say is inborn. For example, infants, under 1 year of age, they notice differences in people's faces, for example, of different races. But noticing differences isn't attaching meaning to differences, and so that's where nurture is going to come into play. Do we have any other questions? Looks like we have a question right up in the front. Thanks, Jennifer.
I'm curious how, over the past 50 years, there's been like little eruptions here and there of the KKK or something. So how did all of these groups that have emerged in the past 6 or 8 years and become so prominent, like Proud Boys and all of these neo-Nazi groups, just all of a sudden they're there and they're there every day on the news? How did that happen that we didn't know about so much going on for 40 or 50 years?
Yeah, great question. Something I think a lot about. Charlottesville, 2017. So one of the ways that we think about the expression of prejudice, and to put it into the historical context, this country has really sort of had a long history of pretty blatant, normatively accepted prejudice and discrimination towards a number of groups. And then the civil rights movement happened, and it started to shift the norms in this country toward we don't accept that anymore. We don't do that anymore. And I think of things really making progress very slowly and not equally for everyone, but making progress up through the election of Barack Obama, what was sort of a pinnacle moment for many of us that do what we do this kind of work. This what? We just elected a non-white male to be the president of the United States. So the norms had really gone to where maybe we're actually getting somewhere with this, right? And then it went the other direction. And what I feel right now as a person, researcher in this area, is that we've seen in a very short amount of time the norms flip back the other direction to where it's now permissible to be as blatantly prejudiced and, derogatory towards groups as you want. That there's support from the leadership of the country at one point for that behavior. Person was modeling it, right? And so, I don't know, sometimes I fight against feeling a lot of despair about what we've lost in, a very short amount of time. Are we back in the right direction? I think there's some indications that we could be, but I think we have a long ways to go. So that, for me, is the explanation for that. Why did this suddenly pop up? Is because, people in charge of this country said, it's okay to do that. Yeah, all that stuff we did in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s to, create more equity. Yeah, we don't have to do that anymore. So one important thing that implies, of course, is that it's always there, right? It's just whether or not we all are okay with it. And that's what's changed. But I think we're fighting back the other way right now.
Any other questions? Okay. It's still hard for me to say. I see, right in the middle.
I'm coming right behind you.
Okay. I just wanted to share an experience that my daughter and I had. A young teenager named Lars came to the United States as the foreign student at Tucson High. And my daughter and he became good friends. And I had him for dinner several times. I got to know him. I liked him. It was a good situation. A couple of years later, my daughter and I went Amtrak. We took the train all through Europe, kind of bumming our way. And we went to visit Lars in his home in northern Germany. And of course, I was a little apprehensive about this, but we did anyway, especially about meeting his parents. Well, his parents weren't there at the home. His older brother was. The parents were on summer vacation, which is for a month, which is what Europeans, especially Germans, do. So perhaps that really was what they were doing. But the older brother and I were having a conversation one night, and Lars must have forgotten to mention that my daughter and I are Jewish. And so the brother, and of course he was taught this adamantly in his schooling, thank God, he said to me, do you know what the Holocaust is? And I could barely keep, from going, are you crazy? But I said nothing, and he then explained to me what the Holocaust was and the Germans' part in it. And I obviously, I've never forgotten that experience, and I'm very happy that he learned that in his German education coming up through the schools.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Do we have any other questions? It looks like, oh, we do.
Me again, sorry. I think there's, for me at least, there's an answer to some of questions you've raised in Pascal Boyer's book, Religion Explained, in which he says, if someone is a member of a particular religious group, it doesn't really matter which one, but they all postulate that the deity is privy to all of your private thoughts and private acts. And if a person can establish clearly that they are a true believer in this particular religion, then other people in that same group can trust them. And you create an in-group of people who can be trusted. That's the positive side. The negative side is it creates the out-group to be hated and distrusted and feared. And Pascal Boyer doesn't have an answer for that, and I sure don't either.
Thank you. we're closing.
to you.
So thank you for joining us today. Thank you to Dr. Jeff Stone, and thank you to our audience. There is the last film of the film festival is going to begin at 2 p.m. today, and we hope that you will join us. Thank you.
Thank you.